Always a pleasure having Dr. Anjhula Bais join us. She's an international psychologist and trauma specialist from the Mind Faculty. Good morning, Doc.
Good morning, guys.
Good morning. Okay, so let's talk about triggers in trauma this week. Since Dr. Christine Blasey Ford came forward with allegations of sexual assault against Judge Brett Kavanaugh, Donald Trump's nominee to the Supreme Court, sexual abuse survivors have been coming forward in droves to show their support for Dr. Ford. Can we talk about triggers? A lot of sexual trauma survivors have reported being triggered by, the hearing that's been going on for the last 2 weeks. Can we talk about triggers, internal and external?
Yes, absolutely. And, the interesting part about this is in the overall context of the Me Too movement, and now there's a hashtag that's trending, I believe her. And then, to have this judge be nominated by Donald Trump, who himself is associated with, for triggering trauma in this sense because of his past with sort of sexual abuse in women. I've seen this a lot in my practice, and it's a very interesting time, and it's triggering quite a movement.
All right. So what kind of triggers are there, Dr. Anjhula?
On one level, triggers are going to feel as different. There's as many, in a way, as there are people. There's internal triggers. There's external triggers. Internal, there's a gamut of things. It could look like anger, anxiety, irritation, feelings of abandonment, vulnerability. In terms of external triggers, it can be people, places, situations.
Mm-hmm. Could you elaborate a little bit with the both external and internal triggers?
So psychologists talk about, locus of control. So in terms of, internal triggers, that would be an internal locus of control experienced very privately by the individual. It's something that's obviously more in their control, and it can be a combination of sort of physical, emotional, and mental. You might have a racing heartbeat, sweaty palms.
Mm-hmm.
You may feel faint because these memories of the past are coming. In terms of the external, I think in the case of these Senate hearings and the judge and Dr. Blasey Ford, probably you're seeing news articles, on your news feed. Mm-hmm. Even people, for example, listening to this segment right now, it might remind them of what they've gone through. So, auditory, visual, you might see somebody that is related or was there around the time of your attack or, knows the attacker. Mm-hmm. So all these sort of external cues can set off a cascade of effects.
We're joined by international psychologist and trauma specialist Dr. Anjhula Bais, where as we discuss triggers this morning, let's look at how you're getting affected by triggers after James Arthur on Lite. Dr. Anjhula Bais is with us. She's an international psychologist and trauma specialist as we look at triggers this morning.
So, Dr. Anjhula, how do you know you're being affected by a trigger? Because sometimes we're not even aware, but suddenly we find ourselves, feeling really worried or anxious, and we don't even know we're being triggered.
Absolutely. And I think, especially in this part of the world where mental health tends to be brushed under the carpet, it's just a figment of your imagination or a weakness of character. Get over it, la. Mm-hmm. I hear all sorts of variations. So it's a good question. If you want to identify triggers, I would ask the following questions. What type of situation are you in? What is happening around you? What kind of emotions are you feeling? What kind of thoughts are you experiencing? And what does your body feel like? Your body is always trying to tell you something. So if you're feeling, flashes, if you're feeling sort of disassociated, like you're floating, ruminating thoughts, feeling kind of exhausted, like it won't stop, it might be flashbacks. So it's worth paying attention to.
We're with international psychologist and trauma specialist Dr. Anjhula Bais is with us this morning on Mind Matters. Next, let's look at how you cope or control those triggers. Next on Lite. 8:23, international psychologist and trauma specialist from the Mind Faculty, Dr. Anjhula Bais joins us on Mind Matters this morning as we discuss triggers.
Okay, so Dr. Anjhula, how do you cope or control your responses to things that trigger you with regard to past trauma?
It's very important to have coping strategies because if we don't have healthy, functional ones, we could, sort of resort to dysfunctional ones, such as numbing through all kinds of addictive behaviors, whether it be drink, drugs, gambling, so on and so forth. I'm a big proponent of mindfulness techniques, and that would subsume things like meditation, breathing techniques, grounding. So, I think the listenership would be familiar with breathing is self-explanatory in meditation, but grounding techniques include things not limited to visualization, Distraction. So if you see a triggering news article, there's your heart's beating fast and you're, getting flashbacks, you can take an ice cube, which is cold, and that temperature change will completely take your mind in a different way. You can bite on a lemon and that taste will again take your palate and your mind.
Yeah.
Absolutely. I encourage my clients to make a playlist, an anger playlist. Quite often Eminem features extensively because clearly he's channeling some trauma and some things, but it really helps for people to connect and ground themselves. So there's a variety of techniques.
Right. But don't you think an anger playlist, when you listen to that, over and over, would just mire you in much less the same?
Well, with anything, it's obviously balance, right? But in that point of time, that's a healthy way to channel your anger and feel healthy as opposed to self-harm or, taking it out on others like our spouse or our kids or anything like that. And also, I'm a very, very big proponent and practitioner of EMDR, which is eye movement desensitization reprocessing. That's a mouthful, but in short, it's a series of eye movements that really, really have stunning results in reprocessing trauma. So quite often what happens is it's like a CD that has a scratch. You're just kind of stuck. You're trying to play to the next song or next memory, but it's like, you can't move forward. Mm-hmm. So through EMDR, these eye movements, you literally reprocess and sort of reprocess the memory, rewire the mind, and the past is no longer the present. So you remain neutral.
Trauma specialist and international psychologist Dr. Anjhula Bais is with us this morning. We're discussing triggers due to trauma this morning. And next, let's look at whether it's wise to avoid or to confront things related to the trauma. We'll discuss that in 10 after Michael Jackson on Lite. Judge Brett Kavanaugh is what is being highlighted in the news internationally these days. In fact, it's not just that, it's also things like the tsunami. And these kind of stories do actually trigger a lot of people who have experienced similar trauma. With us this morning, international psychologist and trauma specialist from the Mind faculty, Dr. Anjhula Bais.
Dr. Anjhula, should you try and avoid things related to your previous trauma? Is it wise to avoid it or confront it head on?
In that sense, some of the experts are split. Some will say, avoid external triggers, try to know them as well as possible. And there is wisdom to that. But my point would differ slightly in that in psychology we know that what you resist persists. So in the avoidance of triggers, that sort of fosters a hypervigilance. But trying to avoid any possible trigger actually in effect causes more anxiety. Mm-hmm. So I think in some sense I'm not asking, an individual to go and find those triggers. But I think just being aware that one can be triggered and what it looks like in and of itself provides a lot of relief because there's validation in that. It's not like, what is this? It's in my head. A lot of people are like, I'm just being over dramatic or they are told that, right? So there's a lot of relief in that. But knowing that you have an array of tools that you can work on individually or with a therapist that can really, really alleviate and reduce trauma is very, very powerful so that you can live your fullest life where you're not missing out, and trying to duck away from this and that. You can face it full on.
Right. But actively confronting your triggers, is that wise?
Like I said, I wouldn't actively purposely go looking for it. But for example, let's say with, your news feed with the Senate hearings are full of Dr. Christine Blasey Ford's testimony and Judge Kavanaugh. You have a choice. You can actually try to find those articles, which is going full on, or you can sort of uninstall Facebook.
Right.
But then, you might miss out on connecting with your friends or family. So both are either extremes. When you see a news article and you feel triggered, like the steps that, I had spoken about earlier, there's things you can do. So the next time you're going to your news feed, you don't feel hijacked. You can take it in stride.
All right.
Dr. Anjhula Bais is with us this morning. She's an international psychologist and trauma specialist as we talk about triggers related to trauma. Next, let's look at whether we can completely remove these triggers on Lite. 8:54, international psychologist and trauma specialist from the Mind faculty, Dr. Anjhula Bais is with us this morning as we discuss the various trauma situations that you might be in and subsequently get affected by triggers.
That's right. So, Dr. Anjhula, can we completely remove triggers? Is this realistic?
Realistically, no. You can't remove triggers, But the good news is there's 50% that you're in control of, like we spoke about, regulating your internal triggers and how you feel. There's 50% that we're not in control of. Something might pop up in a news feed. You might accidentally run into someone in the mall. But the good news is that even the 50% that you're not in control of, you're still in control of how you think about that 50%. So some of the most seminal minds in psychology have stated that it is not what has happened to you. It is not what anybody has said or done to you that exerts effect, but how you think about it. So that's always our choice on how to process, how to reframe, how to ground, and that puts us in a seat of empowerment.
Even with action taken, let's say, for example, in the case of Judge Brett Kavanaugh, right? Now, let's say he does get thrown into jail, hypothetically speaking. Will that bring any closure for Dr. Blasey Ford?
That's a very interesting question. I think, how people define love, happiness, justice, differs from person to person. She may view the fact that she had an opportunity at a highly publicized, highly viewed Senate hearing as making her peace. I do think that, for example, Judge Kavanaugh not ascending to the highest court in the U.S. And maybe even ending up in jail might be the cherry on top for a lot of people. It could provide definitely a satisfaction. But the point I'm trying to make in terms of trauma is that you can still have peace even without that justice. Your not being traumatized doesn't have to be contingent on what happens to Judge Kavanaugh. Because imagine if you are externalizing your happiness to something that's very out of your control, how the Senate votes or, so on and so forth. So we are the locus of control. We can control how we think. And I think maybe for someone like Dr. Blasey Ford, who's a psychologist herself, just the fact that she got up and did her civic duty is enough to put a lot to rest.
Well, it's been a pleasure speaking to you this morning, Dr. Anjhula. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
And if you missed out on all the great advice we got from Dr. Anjhula this morning, don't forget to go and listen to the podcast at lite.my. Next up, it's time for us to look at those songs that you want us to play for you. And also, please tell us who it's for on 016-510-8888. Your relaxing favorites requests are coming up in 30 minutes after 9 on Lite.